how do you get better at shooting at longer distances if you don't have access to a range that lets you shoot beyond 100 yards? Well, this is something that I've been facing recently because I picked up a Primary Arms 3-18x44 first focal plane scope, and it's a mouthful. And I've been enjoying it a lot, but I rarely get the opportunity to shoot it beyond maybe 100, 200 yards just based on the range that I'm going at now. So what do I do to shoot within 100 yards to still be able to refine those skills and still be able to practice as though I am shooting greater than 100 yards? So as a disclaimer, I'm still pretty new to shooting at longer distances, so keep that in mind, but I still believe that you can use what you have at your disposal in order to practice as though you are shooting further out. And so I would frame this video as more as me bringing you guys along to show what I kind of find is working and what I'm still figuring out. And hopefully this helps for you. And of course, if you have tips, feel free to tell me as well. So one thing that jumps out at me, which is pretty easy to practice without having to have, access to like a 500-800 yard range or whatever, is just shooting your rifle without any kind of rear support. So I am so used to, when I have shot at longer distances, shooting with, shooting prone and then also shooting with a rear bag as well. But I decided I would try shoot this way instead. Now, of course, the farther out you shoot, the more your skills will be tested. But for the sake of this exercise, I've noticed that shooting with just no rear bag really can be a bit of a challenge, at least for me. Someone who is so used to shooting within 100 yards anyway with non-magnified optics like a red dot, I'm not so used to seeing how much that the rifle will sway. But because I am shooting with some degree of magnification even within 100 yards for these exercises, I notice how much not having a rear bag to support, to brace my rifle, really does make a difference. So some things that I'm still trying to work on, which I think are pretty important, is just how do I make sure that I'm as steady as possible given the environment, tools that I have, my rifle setup. This was again because it was magnified so I could see more of the change, and just in movement as the rifle swayed naturally. But also it was surprising to me because this is not something that I usually see with my non-magnified optics, or at least is not readily apparent to me in all the other kind of shooting that I've been doing in the past that I've just become so used to. And so what I found was pretty telling and pretty surprising to me is understanding how to get the most stable position for myself without the rear support bag. And so when I'm shooting here off this barricade, I was debating whether to push or pull the rifle into me. Do I pull it back so it hits so the front of the rifle is bracing against the barricade, but also I'm pulling my shoulder into it as well. These are all things that I never had really had to take into consideration before, but now I'm realizing is such an important skill, really foundational, but it's something that I never really had to work on before, but now still within the 100 yards, I can take the time to really make sure I have this locked in. So what I ended up doing is that I would pull the rifle towards me so the base of the tripod that is under the rail hits the back of the barricade. At the same time, I would try to lean into the gun as well to be as stable as possible. And because of the barricade's cutouts here, at the right angle, I would also lean my gun into that as well, so I'm as stable and as braced as possible. And I found this did help a lot. So this is clearly something that you don't need to have, a really long distance range to be able to practice. Now this again is more on just fundamentals and isn't strictly about shooting itself, but is more the position to brace yourself in so you can shoot. But I still am a firm believer, at least from what I've seen so far, that this is a very important thing to know. Proper setup so you can be, ready to take your shots. Now, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this was significantly harder, or at least, more challenging to me than it was shooting in the prone position. Because in previous videos I did, especially with my M16A4, shooting with an ACOG, or even just shooting with this MPVO now, I'm so used to shooting either with a front-facing sandbag or a bipod, and also that rear bag as well. So I always have something very stable, and it's a huge difference to me, I've noticed. So this is definitely something I'll be practicing more. Now, the second thing I was able to practice is getting into position as well. Now, this may not always be applicable to you or frankly to me, under time, depending on what kind of shooting you do. So for competition shooters, I know changing different shooting positions under speed is a very significant thing. But for someone like me, I'm talking more finding the proper shooting stance instead. So I was shooting a little bit between, standing on the barricade and also going into a crouching position as well. And this is something just, didn't feel natural to me just yet. because again, coming from all the previous shooting I do, I'm basically just standing and shooting in a static position. But now if I actually try to move, it's a whole different thing. What I'm realizing is kind of two things. First is that after I'm shooting, I'm almost waiting to see where my shots land, or instead, that's not really too necessary for me. The bullet has already left the barrel, so it's going where it's going. So I can start to get into my next shooting position as quickly as I can from there. And then that's the first thing. The second too is just knowing what is the most comfortable, the most stable shooting position. So when I started the day shooting in the standing position, it's the most familiar to me, so that wasn't really an issue beyond what I just talked about in the first section about knowing how to brace my rifle. But then when I moved into shooting crouching, I was not really sure how to do this very well. I was kind of bending my knees and kneeling forward, but it felt awkward and uncomfortable. So from there, I started to actually crouch even lower, and that became a little more comfortable. And this might sound like something which is kind of obvious. Adjust your shooting position. But it's something that I wasn't too aware of it because I'm always used to shooting standing in a static position as well. And this is also much more difficult because now I have to reacquire my target with, under magnified optics or using magnified optics, which is also still something with the eye box I'm trying to figure out. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you're changing your different shooting positions, I think this is something that you can still practice quite well, and you don't need to have a super long distance range to do it. Now, of course, the farther out you shoot, the more your stance needs to be refined, but still for, if you only have access to a 100-yard range, this can at least get you going in the right direction. Now, actually, I did realize that I did practice shooting standing, kneeling, and prone in different positions when I was shooting, trying the table 2 course of fire for my M16 just for fun, to kind of see how it'd stack up. Maybe it was because that was so long ago, or because I wasn't shooting off a barricade, that it felt really different to me from that experience to shooting, when I filmed this at the range. Maybe it's because I added a barricade. I would have thought that adding a barricade would make my life easier, but it was not something I knew how to use to my advantage, so maybe that's why things were harder for me. But again, it's still a skill you can practice, and you don't need a 1,000,000-yard range to be able to do. So, to wrap up this section, getting into position and knowing the proper shooting stance. Those things are definitely things you can still practice without having access to a beyond 100-yard range, and I believe that these things will be important no matter what distance you shoot at. Now, the last big thing I was able to work on within 100 yards is just knowing the right magnification to use when I'm shooting my optic. So initially when I started shooting, I thought, with 3 to 18 power, I'm just going to crank it all the way to 18 because I have the most magnification. I quickly learned that is not the case. Just because you have the extra magnification, that doesn't mean you need to use all of it. Now, there are a few reasons I've learned pretty quickly why this is, which is that the higher magnification you go, the less forgiving your eye box is, and the more perfectly aligned your eyes need to be with the sight. I used to think that because I was just unfamiliar with optics or magnified optics that, higher magnification is, why would you ever want to go lower when you could have more? But I learned this is not the case. So what I ended up doing is that I dialed my magnification a little higher than the minimum 3 yards in the scope. I think I got to maybe about 6 to 8, or maybe I could have done even less, but I wanted to just have a little more magnification. I know it's not necessary to be able to do this at 100 yards, but I had it at my disposal. So I chose a good blend between extra magnification out of personal preference, but not so magnified that I felt like I was detracting from my shooting time, because I was spending so much of that time trying to actually make sure I had perfect eye alignment with my scope. The last thing I found that I can work on too, if this applies to you as well, is being able to shoot your offset optic on your MPVO or your LPVO. So for me, I went with a Holosun 407C or something, and I mounted it directly on top of my MPVO as opposed to the side. And so what I found is that while shooting a red dot is something I'm familiar with, it's a little bit different using it on the MPVO when it's mounted this high because of the height difference. I am not actually, my chin doesn't actually rest, or my face doesn't actually rest on the buttstock. And so I have one less point of contact. And so this takes a little bit of getting used to, something that I'm still trying to kind of figure out, but overall it's pretty pleasant and is not nearly as bad as I've heard some people say it would be. I will say at first though, what I had to do is I found that when I was shooting at 50 yards now at this point with my red dot, I was not hitting the steel at all. I thought I just sucked, but it turns out that I just wasn't zeroed at all. So I did spend some time shooting, zeroing that in first. Then I went back and shot again, and things were a lot better. So that was a little bit of a, what the hell kind of moment, but that was fine in the end. Now, with this said, I did mention that there are some skills you cannot work on, shooting within 100 yards. And so far what I've found is that dialing or knowing how to use my mill grid reticle, or MOA if you want to use that, is not something I've been able to know how to do. Yes, you can dial it for wind, you change your zero based off your conditions and stuff like that, but knowing how to use the grid to hold or for ranging and things like that, I'm not sure how to do that at such a close distance yet. I feel like those are things that I need to use at a longer distance to really take full advantage and really know how to use the reticle. And so that's one thing I found, that shooting within 100 yards, you can do a lot, but there are some things I'm noticing you probably have to shoot at longer distance to do. And using the mill grid reticle, or any reticle or grid or whatever, is something that I think falls into that latter category. So that'll do it for this video, guys. Hopefully it helps. It's not always common for people to have access to 100-yard ranges or more, but what if you still want to be able to practice those skills like you did have that kind of access to ranges? So hopefully this helps. I'll keep bringing you guys along as I kind of learn more and see what works and what doesn't work, and I'll keep sharing with you guys. So thanks for tuning in. Catch you guys in the next one.